Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Chat. It's the daf for Hoshan Rabbah. Today's daf is sponsored by Sylvia Klein in loving memory of her mother, Lila Klein, Leah Bat Yosef Pasha. She dedicated her life to family, her students, Israel, and the Jewish people. We're going to start our daf with Yocheved. We were talking about the Benot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad. From there, we're going to get to Moshe Rabbeinu's mother. How so? We're going to see right now because we ended yesterday's daf with how could it be that the Benot Tzlofchad were tzadkaniot, right? They were tzidkaniot. Sorry, I was pronouncing that wrong. They were tzidkaniot. They were righteous women who didn't, even the youngest one didn't even get married until she was over 40, which to say, wait, but women over 40 can have children. And then they said, well, they were like Yocheved, who were able to have children at an older age. How do we know this? And now we're going to see that Yocheved was 130 when Moshe was born. And she kind of had a miracle happen to her, and she was like a young woman. The commentators asked, why didn't they compare her to Sarah, who also had a baby when she was very old? But there, they say maybe because Yocheved was the same generation or lived around, not the same really, but lived at a similar time. Perhaps that's why. Anyway, it's a good question. So now they say, okay, there's a study guide for today, and we're going to use it as we learn. We're going to start with this pasuk, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. Okay, so it says a man went from the house of Levi, that's Amram. Notice he doesn't have a name, neither does she. But Yikach bat Levi, and he takes the daughter of Levi. Now, bat means daughter, but it also means young woman. So the Gemara is going to ask here, starting with the very top of our daf, Efshar bat me'u shloshim shana v'kara bat. She was 130 years old. How could they call her a bat? Now, how do we know she was 130 years old? Well, the Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, zo Yocheved. Okay, this Bat Levi who gets married to this Ben Levi, right? Vayikach always means marriage, which in and of itself, by the way, is strange because what the pasuk is going to say. I'm kind of in the middle of a few thoughts here, but let's just explain. What happens is this is the pasuk right before she gets pregnant with Moshe. So he goes out, marries this Bat Levi, and then she gets pregnant. There's an obvious problem here, which is she had two children already, Miriam and Aaron. What do you mean they were getting married? We're going to get back to that soon. But now we want to know, when was Yocheved born and how do we know she was 130? Well, Yocheved, it was known, right? She was, this, by the way, we're going to see this in a few dapim also. Again, it's going to come up. Yocheved was in she was conceived on the way into Egypt, and was born Bein HaChamod, and was born between the walls as they were getting into Egypt. This, by the way, explains this when Yaakov came with 70 people. The problem is there's really only 69 in the list. There's one missing, so they say, oh, that was Yocheved. Okay, how do we know Yocheved? Because it says, Tichtiv asher yalda ota leLevi b'Mitzrayim. It says she was born to Levi in Egypt. The drasha is Leidata b'Mitzrayim v'orata shelo b'Mitzrayim. Her birth was in Mitzrayim, but it seems like she wasn't conceived in Mitzrayim because she was specifically born there but not conceived, and therefore it must be she was the one. Okay, this is why they know there was someone who was kind of on the list but not fully on the list, because she doesn't get named as the people who went down to Egypt. So this must be her. Amai karula bat. So why they call her bat? Amarav Yehuda bar Tzvi melamed shenoldu ba simanei na'arut. Nitadena basal, nitpashtu akmatim, v'chazara yofi l'mkomo. Okay, what every older woman wants, right? Her skin softened, her wrinkles, right, got stretched, right? They were, as if like she had a face job, plastic surgery, and right, they're spread out. I'm trying to think of the right translation, and her beauty came back to the way it was. So now they say, okay, before we go on, I just want to get to the years, how we get that she was 130. Okay, so now, if she was born when they got down to Egypt, according to the tradition, they were in Egypt, and I put this on the sheet, they were in Egypt for 220 years. So if she was still alive at the time they got out of Egypt, she would have been 210 years old, because she exactly came in when they went down to Egypt. Now, Moshe, when the Jews got out of Egypt, was 80. So basically that would mean if you subtract 80 from 210, you're going to get 130. How do we know he was 80? Because he died at 120 and they were in the desert for 40 years. So when they got out of Egypt, he was 80 years old. Okay, so there you have our chronology. So she was very old, but yet a miracle happened, and the Benot Tzlofchad were the same. But since we're already on Yocheved, we're going to talk about a few more things here that don't make sense. Vayikach vayachzor mibayale. Why did it say he married her? It should have been he returned to her, because as we said, okay, if you look at the Gemara in Sota, which I brought on the page, Gemara in Sota Daf Yud Bet says here, Vayelach ish mi Beit Levi, where did he go? Amar Rav Yehuda bar Tzvina halach ba'atzaf bito. He went because his daughter recommended he go. Meaning, what happened here? Well, okay, I'll paraphrase. I won't read it all inside. But Paro said all the male children are going to be thrown into the Nile. And Amar said, okay, what are we doing being married then? The whole point of marriage is to have children, right? Even though there are more points to that than marriage. But he thought, oh, well, it's all for children. I may as well divorce my wife. And right, why will I bring children into the world and they'll be killed? So everybody followed him because he was a leader. And then the daughter said, you're being worse than Paro. Paro just said the male children, and you're now not allowing males or females to be born. And Paro only said in this world, and you're doing this world in the next world. And Paro, maybe he'll do what he says, maybe he won't. But everyone's going to do what you said. And therefore, he's convinced by his daughter, and he brings back his wife. And then the Gemara there goes through the same drashot that we're going to go through here. So we're going to read it inside now in our Gemara. Should have been he returned her to be married to him, right? Because that's what he did. He took her back as a wife. He made it as if like the second marriage was as great as the first. He did a whole big celebration. He put her in a chair. These are those chairs you might see in movies where they carry people on a chair. Aharon and Miriam and Aaron and Miriam are singing before him. And the Malachim are saying, wow, the mother of sons is so happy because she knows, right, this is this idea that they had this big celebration because they were bringing them back together, and the idea was that there was some understanding that they were going to give birth to the future Moshe Rabbeinu, the leader who's going to redeem the Jewish people. Okay, now we're back to the Benot Tzlofchad. Okay, so now we say Lahalan. Okay, now we have 2 points where the Benot Tzlofchad are mentioned, and they're mentioned by name. So we're going to look at the psukim now. So going further down on the sheet, in Bamidbar Lamed Vav, when they go to get married, Lahalan Mina'ana Katuv Derech Gedelatan. Okay, when they got married, the order is, okay, in Bamidbar Lamed Vav, if you look at Pasuk Yud Aleph, the last Pasuk here, Batiena Machla Terza Hogla Milka V'Noah Benot Tzlofchad L'Bnei Dodehen L'Nashim. When they got married, it lists them in that order. But Kan Derech Chochmatan. But when they stood before Moshe, it's a different order. Okay, if you look at Bamidbar Kaf Zayin, it's Machla. Okay, she's still the first, but it's Noah Chogla Milka V'Tirza instead of Tirza Chagla Milka V'Noah. It's a totally different order, right? In fact, the last one is now second. So why is that? So Lahala Mina'an Derek Gedelatan. There they were mentioned in order of birth. That was the first pasuk we saw, which is actually the later pasuk when they go get married. When they go to Moshe with their question, it's in order of who is smarter. And this supports what Rabbi Ami said. If you're sitting in judgment or something along those lines, you're going to always give honor more so to the wiser person. But when you're at a party, and that was where they got married, but when they go to Moshe, it's more for judgment. When they go to get married, it's more for celebration. And the commentaries say even like for anything else, it goes achar zikna, goes by birth order. Okay, so birth order is important, but not when you're coming to court. There we give the most respect to the wisest among them. And right, therefore the order goes by who is wiser than the other. This whole thing about being careful about the order is only if you're talking about someone who's exceptionally wise or exceptionally elderly, okay? Then you're going to go by age, or then you're going to go by wisdom. But if it's not such a big discrepancy between them, or it's not someone who's uniquely, very wise or very old, then it's not so important, like it seems, like they said before. Tana debate Rabbi Yishmael. Now, okay, and this is a whole different opinion from what we saw before, where we just said there was an order, right? We just said there was ones who were smarter. But now comes Rabbi Yishmael and said, Benot Tzlofchad shkulotayu, shenemar v'tiyena. Now, when it says they got married, it says Vatiyena, and then it lists their names, right? And it said L'nashim, L'bnei Dodehem L'nashim, right? They marry their cousins. But the word Tiena, they say, it could have just said Vatihi, or it could have said it some other way, or maybe it didn't even need that word. So they say from here they learn they were all equal. Okay, it wasn't like one was smarter than the other. Then you have to understand why they changed the order. We don't know, but he thinks that they were all equal and wasn't like one was better than the other. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Bnot Tzlofchad hutru linaseh l'chol hashvatim. Now we're going to get back to who can marry who and what this whole rule is. And in fact, let's just look for one quick minute at the psukim. If we look at the psukim here in Bamidbar Lamed Vav, Zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem. You'll see I bolded a lot of words. Those are words we're going to darshan today. This is what God told the Bnot Tzlofchad to say. L'tov be'enihem tiena l'nashim. Anyone you want, you can marry. Ach le'mishpacha mateh avihem tiena l'nashim. But only within your family's tribe. There's a bit of a strange pasuk because anyone sounds like anyone, but then all of a sudden it's limited just within your tribe. Okay, and then it says we don't want nachala to go from tribe to tribe, right? And then it gives the general rule, the chol bat yoreshet nachala, and for all women who inherit territory from Matopodei Israel, she can only marry within the shevet, l'man Yoshu Israel, right? Because we don't want the nachala to move from tribe to tribe. So we're going to now understand these psukim and figure out exactly what's going on here. So Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, the Bnot Tzlofchad hutru linaseh l'chol hashvatim. They actually were allowed to marry anyone they wanted. Okay, contrary to what we would have thought, because it says l'tov b'neihem tiena l'nashim. So now, elamani became ach l'mishpacha mateh avihem tiena l'nashim. So why does it say them? But you should stay within the family if they were allowed to marry anyone they wanted. We said before how they were very careful and they only married people who were appropriate for them. Well, now we see that wasn't just because they thought it was a good thing to do, but basically Moshe was telling them, listen, you really should stay within your tribe because that's the most appropriate for you, okay? Apparently, right, there's always, we see this in the Torah in general, when they send to find a wife for Yitzchak, they want to keep it within the family, even within the tribe, okay, not just about marrying Jews. I mean, even then it wasn't married Jews, there wasn't a Jew, in Lavan's house, but in Betuel's house. But basically, the idea is that the tribe is the most appropriate. So you should stay within your tribe, but you don't have to. It's actually not forbidden for you, even though the psukim clearly seem to be concerned about the nachala moving, but it seems it's not an issue for them. So now they say, and then what we're basically saying is that the prohibition to marry someone from another tribe was for all other women, and we're going to see, though, women in that generation. Any other woman who inherits, okay, but in a little while we're going to get to, but not the Bnot Tzlofchad. For them, it really wasn't forbidden. Motiv Rabbah. Rabbah says, wait a minute, I'm going to bring a contradiction from the following source. Okay, and now we're going to a different pasuk. And this is a pasuk in Vayikra Kaf Bet, pasuk Gimel. Okay, after it says they're talking to Aaron and his sons, it says, Emor alehem, say to them, lidorotechem, okay, for all generations. So there was, right, God said, speak to them, specifically the people standing before you, but this will be for generations. So they say, Emor alehem, lo tamum gimel har Sinai. That's for those people right now. Okay, by the way, this is a pasuk about anyone who has a sacrifice and is eating kodshim, is eating sacrificial meat, while he's tamei, will get kared. Okay, you can't eat sacrificial meat while you're impure. If you do, you'll get kared. And this was said to them, which is to those standing at Har Sinai when they got the Torah, right? The people, meaning that generation. But l'dorotechem elu dorot haba'im. So now they say, okay, this is a braita, and this is what Rab is bringing us a contradiction, but we'll get to the contradiction in a little while. In nemar avot, lama nemar banim. Nemar banim, lama nemar avot. Why does it have to say to you, emor alehem, and the dorotechem? Okay, why do you need both? Wouldn't we just assume any commandment in the Torah is for now and for future generations? And that's going to be a big topic for today's daf, really, about do we assume that mitzvot are given for all generations, for this one and for the upcoming, or not necessarily? So okay, there's certain things that are for the next generation that aren't for this generation, and there's certain things that are for this generation that aren't for future generations. What are they? Well, ba'avot hu omer v'chol bat yoresh nachala. Okay, so avot, what was given to this generation, but not to the next generation? That's this pasuk, v'chol bat yoresh nachala. It was only for this generation. It wasn't. Okay, now we're learning that this idea that people can't marry someone from another tribe if they inherited land is only for the generation going into the land, which seems to include, by the way, the Bnot Tzlofchad. Okay? And by the way, there's tons of mitzvot in the Torah, most of them being mitzvot tliyot ba'aretz, that are dependent on the land, that were not given to the generation that was standing there right now. It was given only to the next generation. So because there's some that are only like the forbidden, right? You can't, if you inherit land, you can't marry someone from, if you're a girl who inherits land, you can't marry someone from another tribe. And the reverse, all these mitzvot that are dependent on the land that weren't given now, but were given for later. Well, because of that, because there's some that are that way and some that are that way, that's why the pasuk needed to say both that, this, and that, and that's why it said in Lehem, so that we don't get confused and think that maybe this was just for that generation, that if you're impure and you eat sacrificial meat, you'll be killed. Okay, you'll get curried. Now, why was this contradiction? Because right? So what did we say? It was for that generation, meaning obviously also for Bnot Tzlofchad, and Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that they actually were allowed to marry anyone they wanted. So who motiv lava who mafarid? Rabba brought the difficulty, and Rabba answers the question. Levar mi Bnot Tzlofchad, and this is what I said before. And now we read these psukim as if they're two different sections, and we read them like this. If we go back to Bamidbar, chapter 36, right? You can marry anyone you want, but better to marry within your tribe because they're better, they're more appropriate for you. Even though it does say, and that way the nachala won't leave your land, but it's not saying it was forbidden. Maybe better to do it this way, but it's not really forbidden. But the next pasuk chet, kol bat yoresh nachala, right? Any daughter who inherits has to stay within the tribe, right? That's already a commandment, but it was, and that's forbidden for them if there's other women that inherit in that generation when they go into the land. But it's only for that generation. It's not beyond that. Okay, let's just stop for 1 minute though and understand. And then, by the way, right, that was why this was given specifically for that generation only. That was an example. There are other mitzvot that were given for future generations only. And that's why we had this. And that was all just to tell us that's why we had a Mor Lehem and the Dor Techem. But again, the main point being that Bnot Tzlofchad was permitted, but the other women of that generation, it was forbidden. Why, by the way, would it be forbidden specifically for this generation and not an issue going forward? So there are different answers given. One of them that seemed convincing to me was that when they go into the land and they conquer the land, there was a concern that if people knew that their land could go and be given over to other tribes, they might not work so hard to conquer the land. So they wanted for that generation for all the land to go specifically to that tribe, so that the tribes worked hard to get the land, knowing that it would actually stay within them, even if their daughters married out, right? Even if their daughters inherited, they wouldn't be able to marry out. And that was a way that encouraged people to actually conquer the land properly. Once that was over, it wasn't as significant. That's a possible answer. Okay, getting back to our Gemara now. Amar Mar means we're going back to something we said before that was quoted in this braita. So the braita that Rabba quoted to raise difficulty, which we resolved, it said, "Ba'avot omer b'chol ba'yoresh nachala, ba'avot im ba'banim lo." Right? It seemed very clear. Now, this we didn't really. I just gave a reason for it, but how do we know from the psukim that it's only for girls or women of that generation? Okay, they took it as a given, but why? Where did they get it from? My mashma. Where do we understand that from? So Amar Rav, Amar Kra, zeh hadavar. So the whole section there, when it talks about this whole problem of the Nachalan moving, starts off with the word zeh hadavar. This is going to be our topic really for the rest of today's stuff, this zeh hadavar. Davar is always a limitation. Okay, we're going to see it in different contexts and see what actually it's limiting. Davar ze lo yehenoheg ela b'dor zeh. So in this case, they're saying this means this is only for this generation. Those words davar, this is the thing. Okay, this is the words that God commanded. This is the idea here. This is just for now. That's what davar. It comes to limit in time. So now they're going to bring two different examples of a place where it says zadavar, and they're going to say, what? This was only for the future, for that generation? No way, no how. So the first is Vayikra Yud Zayin, Pasuk Bet. Speak to Aaron and his sons and all of the Jewish people, and say to them, and it's basically saying, if you slaughter an animal that was supposed to be a sacrifice, you have to slaughter it in the temple. If you slaughter it outside the temple, you're going to get cut off, karet again. Okay, very serious. Now, that was just for that generation? Of course not. It was for all future generations. So, no way, right? It was only for that generation? No. So they say, no, there's an obvious reason. Because Shanahatam, because it says there, lidorotam. Okay, this pasuk, I forgot to bring this pasuk on your sheet. Okay, but right, this is a pasuk about not having the sacrifices go to that they won't bring them in for idols. Okay, this will be for future generations. So because the Dorotam appears a few psukim later, they connect it with here and they say that proves that the Zadavar there is not coming to limited in time. It works also for future generations. Okay, we're going to have to figure out then what is Zadavar there for if it's not there for that. But we'll get to that soon. Turning now to Amud Bet. Now we're moving to Bamidbar, chapter 30, verse 2. Moshe spoke to the heads of the matot of Bnei Israel, heads of the tribes, saying, this is the thing, Zadavar again, Asher Tzivah Hashem. And then it says, if you take a neder, you have to keep. If you take a vow, you have to keep your vow, do everything you said. And then we get into if a woman takes a neder, the husband can annul her vows. So it's the whole section about annulling vows. Now, Zadavar Rashem Matot, what? That's only in this generation? Of course not. If you take a vow, you have to keep it, even in future generations. So Armalei, hahu yalif la zezemehat. Well, one shchute chutz, because it said l'dorotam, and shchute chutz we know said zadavar, but it was also for future generations. Well, now we can make a gzera shava from where it talked about shchute chutz, slaughtering outside the temple, to where it talks about vows, and say, just like there in slaughtering outside the temple, it's for all future generations, because it said for future generations. Also, this section about the vows is for future generations. So now they say, okay, wait a minute. Hainami, if that's the case, so why don't you say that Zadavar by the Kobat Yoresh and Achala then also learn from Gzera Shava? Again, what's Gzera Shava? We have the same word that appears in both places, and we'll learn from one to the other. Also here, it says Zadavar by that they can't marry outside the tribe. So why don't we just say that that's also for future generations learned out from the Shchutei Chutz Psuki? To which they said, Bishla Mahatam eats Gzera Shava. There you needed the Gzera Shava between the two. Okay, and we're going to see why, meaning there was a purpose for the Gzera Shava. There's all sorts of laws we're going to learn from one to the other, and therefore it made sense to make the Gzera Shava between the Nidarim and the Shchutei Chutz. But Chalamai Itzrich. But here, why would you need it? Okay, now let's think about it. The only thing that you would learn from Gzera Shava from the Banot Tzlofchad and the really the other Banot, who all other girls who inherit, would not be able to marry out. The one thing you would learn from the Zadavar would be that it's for future generations. But if that's why they're learning it for future generations, well, Lishta Kramine Vani Adana Dilidorotu. Unless proven otherwise, we assume all mitzvot are given for this generation and for future generations. Yes, it's true, there's a bunch that aren't. But unless it tells us otherwise, we're gonna the default is it's for all generations. So it wouldn't need to bring the word hadavar to compare it to shchutei chutz from there to learn that it's for future generations. It could have just said nothing, and we would just assume it was for all generations. So therefore, it must be that that's why we don't make a gzera shava, and that's why we assume hadavar is limiting, and we limit it in time just for that generation, and we don't learn from it this gzera shava. So now they want to know. Now the beginning of this was introduced as, well, we understand there's a gzera shava between shchutei chutz and hafarat nedarim. That's needed for all sorts of other things. So that's why we got to the fact that hadavar and nedarim is also for future generations, just like the shchutei chutz. So now they want to know my gzera shava. What's this gzera shava that we're talking about, and why was it needed? Tanya, as it says in a braita, ne'emal kan hadavar, v'ne'emar lahalan hadavar. It says hadavar in shchutei chutz, and it says it by hafarat nedarim. Null in your vows. Ma lahalan Aharon ubanav v'chol Yisrael. Okay, if you remember there, it said in shchutei chutz, Aaron, his sons, and all of the Jewish people. Avkan Aharon ubanav v'chol Yisrael. Same thing by undoing vows. Now, there's two things in undoing vows. In fact, we'll get at the end of the daf to a difference between them. One is hatarat neder, which is usually done by 3 people, like a court, or one unique individual who's an expert. Okay, chacham. Hafarat nedarim is done a husband to his wife. Okay, and that's when a woman vows and the husband hears on the day, and he could say, no, your vow is off. Okay, I'm undoing your vow. Now, what are we saying here? Just like there it said, Aaron ubanav v'chol Yisrael, also by nedarim, it's also Aaron or his sons or all the Jewish people. So we'll get to what that means in a minute. They haven't yet explained. Now the intro, okay, these are both the intro psukim to the section. Intro psukim to the shchutei chutz was to Aaron and his sons and all of Israel. Intro pasuk for neder, for vows, was Rashi Matot, the heads of the tribes. So af lahalan Rashi Matot. So just like heads of the tribes in neder, also heads of the tribes in shchutei chutz, slaughtering outdoors. So we don't know what that means yet, right? Slaughtering outside the temple. So we don't know what this means. We'll get there soon. Amar. So that's where we're going to get to it right now. We're going to just go back to this braita we just quoted. In other words, that told us what we learned from the gzera shava, but we didn't really understand it. So, what are we learning by the fact that neder can be done by Aharon, his sons, or any Jew? What does it teach us? When you want to undo your vows, now it's really not hafarah, it's really what we call hatarat neder. What we do Erev Rosh Hashanah, some people do it Erev Yom Kippur. You can actually do it Tol Shana Rabbah, which is today. So Hafarat Nedarim is done with 3 regular people. Okay, you need a court, but a court could be any 3 individuals, and that's what we learn from the shchutei chutz. Because it says, and all the Jewish people, it shows all the Jewish people can also do the undoing of the vows. But wait. How could you say it could be done by everybody? The beginning of the section said the heads of the tribes. Sounds like only an important, prominent person. Well, Kid Amr of Chis Amr of Yochanan, like he says, which we're going to see in a few dapim. It's going to come up, I forget now which, it's in the next daf, tomorrow's daf. We're going to see where he says this. But just like he says somewhere else, and he answers a question like this and explains Yachid Mumchem, when it says Rashi Matot, that means that, Hatarat Nedarim, you can do in front of 3 people in a court. But if you had an expert, all you really need is 1 expert. So Hachanami will say the same thing by us, the Yachid Mumcha, and that's why it says Rashi Matot. So we have the first part of the gzera shava explained right now, which is if you have a Yachid Mumcha, well, then we just go by the simple reading of the verse. The Rashi Matot, the head of the tribe, can take care of it. Someone prominent, important, like a judge, a knowledgeable person. But if you have a second alternative, and that's learned from shchutei chutz, that it can be done by all Yisrael. And there was just a commandment given to all Yisrael about not slaughtering things outside the temple, not slaughtering sacrifices outside the temple. But we learn by the introduction there, because of the gzera shava, comparing it to Hatarat Nedarim, Hatarat Nedarim can be done by 3 regular people. Now we get to the second part of this gzera shava. What we're doing reverse, what we're learning from the neder section from the vows to the section about slaughtering outside the temple. Again, slaughtering sacrifices outside the temple. So just like here, it's the heads of tribes and vows. Also, by slaughtering outside the temple, it's the heads of tribes. L'ma hilchata, what's the halacha here? What this is teaching you is that just like, okay, there's Gzera Shava, heads of tribes, the fact, in other words, we're learning idea of heads of tribes to there, meaning, just like you go to the head of a tribe or an important person and undo your vow, you could also undo something that you made sanctified. Okay, you consecrated an item. If you want to remove the consecration, you can. You can go to a chacham, to an important person, and say, "Listen, I have an issue. I didn't realize that if I do this, then blah blah blah," and you explain your reason, and they can undo your vow. Okay, because hekdesh is like a vow. So that's what we learn. That's what the Gzera Shava in the opposite direction goes to teach you. So now they say, okay, that works fine and well according to Beit Hillel, but LeBeit Shammai. So the Beit Shammai de'amri ein sheila behekdesh. Beit Shammai holds you can't undo hekdesh. How do we know this? Well, we're going to quote a machloka between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, which is a little different, but we can learn from one to the other. Ditnan, it says in a Mishnah, Beit Shammai Ambali, hekdesh ta'ut hekdesh. If you do hekdesh by accident, the example they bring in the Durham is that you said the next black ox to come out the door is hekdesh, and then a white ox walks out the door. Now, what you really meant was the next ox to come out the door, but you said black. Kind of made a mistake because you assumed it was going to be black. It turns out it was white. So Beit Shammai says this is hekdesh because even though you made a mistake, it's still hekdesh. Beit Hillel, we ain't no hekdesh. Beit Hillel said no, you made a mistake and it's not hekdesh because that's not what you meant. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, if you think that hekdesh by mistake is not hekdesh, then you could see on that same note, you could undo a vow. Because what's the basis of undoing a vow? You basically go to the chacham and say, listen, had I known, I wouldn't have done this, which is sort of like a mistake. According to Beit Hillel, according to Beit Shammai, hekdesh b'ta'ud is hekdesh. You can't right, which would then mean you can't undo it. It doesn't, right? Now, if you made a mistake, you wouldn't need to go to a chacham to undo it. It would just be not hekdesh because you made a mistake, according to Beit Hillel. According to Beit Shammai, if it's a mistake, it's too bad it's hekdesh. Well, then, of course, you can't go another step farther and try to get your vow undone. Right? A vow you want to undo or hekdesh you want to undo is not hekdesh was made by mistake. It's just, you say now, in hindsight, I really wouldn't have done that. It's not like it was really a mistake, but it's sort of like a mistake, and that's why we connect these two ideas. And then we say we have a problem because according to Beit Shammai, who says there is no sheila b'hekdesh, so there's no point for the Gzera Shava in the other direction. So, so he must not have the Gzera Shava. So what does he do with these words, hadavar and hadavar, that's said in the Shchut and in the Neder? And we assume that if it doesn't go in one direction, it doesn't go in the other direction, therefore you must not have this Gzera Shava at all. And now we have to figure out, so what does Beit Shammai understand? What's zip is it? Remember how we got here, okay? There's a lot of different things going on here. But we started with hadavar by the Bat Yoreshet is teaching you only that generation. Then we said, what about Shchutei Chutz? It also says hadavar. And then we said, well, there it says the Torah Tam. So what about Neder? Also, it must be for future generations, but it says hadavar. We said, we learned that from Gzera Shava from the Shchutei Chutz. And then why didn't we learn the Bat in Gzera Shava? Well, that's because we wouldn't need the word hadavar if it wasn't going to limit something, because, right, we wouldn't need the Gzera Shava at all, because to learn it's for all generations, we just wouldn't have said anything, and it would have been obvious it was for all generations. Whereas the zeh hadavar v'zeh hadavar in Shchutei Chutz and Neder, we had a reason to make this Gzera Shava, and that's because we learned two other halachot from the Gzera Shava. We learned that you could do 3 hedyotot for Nedarim, just like it said Aaron and and his sons and all the Jewish people. And we learned the reverse, that you can undo hekdesh. Okay, that's what we learned from Neder to hekdesh. So that was all to explain why it was clear we needed this Gzera Shava anyway in that case, but that's not true for the Bat Yoreshet, and that's why that in the Bat Yoreshet case, we're going to say hadavar limits, right? Limits it in what way? Limits it in the sense that it's only for that generation. So now we're stuck with, though, what do we do with the hadavar and hadavar when we don't have a Gzera Shava according to Beit Shammai? So hadavar de Shchutei Chutz, okay, each one now is going to be just for that section. No Gzera Shava, no comparison. The hadavar again, which we always say is limiting, it's to teach you de Shchutei Chutz mebayile. Hadavar de Shchutei Chutz. What do we need it for? Mebayile. We need it for this. Ala shochet hu chayav ve'eno chayav al ha molek. Okay, what is malika? Malika is how they slaughter birds in the temple. They didn't slaughter them. The Kohen would do it in a special way. He would use his finger, his thumb, and the back of the neck, and with that he would slaughter the bird. It was not called slaughtering, it was called malika. Now, the only way you can do bird sacrifices in the Beit HaMikdash is by malika. If you do shchita, it's not a good sacrifice. However, by shchutei chutz, since it says zeh hadavar, and it's talking about slaughtering, they say that when are you going to be liable, kare, for doing it on a bird? Only if you slaughter the bird outside the temple, not if you did malika. Even though malika is what you should have done with the sacrifice inside the temple, but if you do it outside the temple, only if you slaughter it will you be liable, kare, and that's what zeh hadavar comes to limit. Zeh hadavar de rashei hamatot, what is that for? Mibayalei lechacham matil ve'ein baal matil. Baal mefil ve'ein chacham mefil. So what do we learn from zeh hadavar of rashei hamatot? It's to teach you that a chacham can undo a vow, but not a husband. A husband can nullify a vow, but not the chacham. Okay, it's hard for me to translate these words exactly into English. But what they're basically saying is hafara, and I told you we talked about the differences at the end of today's talk. There's a difference between hatara and hafara. Hatara is meant for a chacham, or 3 adyotot, 3 regular people, and hafara is meant for a husband. Hafara can be done. One of the differences. So first of all, the Rashbam says that means that if you go to a chacham, if you do hatara nedarim, what they do is they say after you say the text, I'm sorry, I want to undo my vows. The people sitting there say mutalach, mutalach, mutalach. Okay, it's now permitted. It's like untying. That's what they're undoing the vow. And if a husband uses that language, or the chacham says mufarlach, 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 it's no good. That's the first thing they say about this. That's the Rashbam, which is you have to use that language if you're the husband. You have to use that language, a different language if you're a person undoing a vow. But there's a bunch of other differences. I'll tell you one of them. We learned about this when we learned Nedarim. Another difference, by the way, is that hafara is basically a husband can do it without any reason whatsoever. He just says, I don't like your vow, I'm undoing it. Hatara, there has to be, you have to come and say, listen, I didn't really mean it. There's what we call a petach. You have to have an explanation. And you have to have charata, where you feel bad that you did it. Without that, the chacham can't undo your vow. You can't just undo your vow for no reason whatsoever. Whereas hafara, you actually can. And hatara, they say, is like undoing it as if it never existed. Hafara is a little different in that sense. But anyway, those are some differences. But the point is, zeh hadavar means if there's very specific, unique rules. Chacham does it one way, husband does it a different way. And now we're going to say, well, according to Beit Shammai, we don't have the Gzera Shava. So we can't learn the Shlosha Yotot from Shchutei Chutz. So the Beit Shammai, the Leilu Gzera Shava, Hafarat Nedarim, B'Shlosha Yotot Menale. Where's he going to get the fact that you could do Hafarat Nedarim, or Hatarat Nedarim, really, it should be not Hafarat, with 3 Hadyotot. And they're going to say, Nafkalumi Detanya, it's going to come from the following braita, and that I'm going to leave for tomorrow's Shiur. Okay, so what did we do today? We started with the Benot Tzlofchad were like Yocheved, that they were older and yet were able to have children, just like Yocheved had a baby at 130 years old. How do we know that? We had all the drashot about how we got to the background to Yocheved and the birth of Moshe, and how the parents got back together again, right? They weren't married, they were divorced, and then they came back together. And then we see when she was born when they came into Mitzrayim. That's how we know how old she was. That's how we know she was 130, and we got to that. Then we talked about the difference in the order, and we said there was one way to explain it was that in one section they went by chokhmah because they were coming to judgment, and the other one they went by age order. And then Rabbi Yishmael didn't really agree with that. He said they were all just as smart as the other, and they were all equal. And you learned that from the word tien. And then we had this whole thing about, and that got us off on our big tangent about Benot Tzlofchad were allowed to marry. From that we said what they could marry anyone they wanted, right? We dealt with that confusing pasuk. Yeah, they can marry anyone they wanted, but it was better if they married within the tribe. But other women of their generation, and only of their generation, that's how we got into this whole other thing, only of their generation, other women were allowed to, couldn't marry outside the tribe, but it was only for that generation, not for other generations, and that we got from the zeh hadavar, and from there we got off on a whole tangent about the zeh hadavars that appear in Shchutei Chutz and Hafarat Nedarim, and from there we had a whole dealing with how do we explain those, and there's a Gzera Shava, but Beit Shammai didn't have a Gzera Shava, and then we had to say, well, then what does he do as zeh hadavar, and also where does he learn what we learned from before from the zeh hadavar about the Shlosha Yotot. That's where we ended today. Wishing everyone meaningful Hoshana Rabbah and a Chag Sameach for Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah.